What makes a son snap so completely that he walks into a courtroom shackled, raving, and accused of butchering the two people who gave him life? That's not the opening to a psychological thriller or a twisted HBO drama. That's real. That's Nick Reiner. And that's what the world witnessed, live, raw, and horrifying. When the 32-year-old son of beloved actor-director Rob Reiner was dragged into court, screaming nonsense, wearing a suicide smock, and charged with the most unimaginable crime of all, murdering his own parents. Rob Reiner, the man behind A Few Good Men, The Princess Bride, Misery, When Harry Met Sally. A man who helped define modern American cinema. A man who, for millions, was more than just a director. He was the voice of morality, comedy, and culture. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now he's gone, and the person standing accused of stabbing him to death, along with his wife Michelle Singer Reiner, is the very child they raised, defended, and loved through decades of struggle. So how did we get here? How did this Hollywood fairy tale end in blood, betrayal, and courtroom chaos? And most disturbingly, why? Because as the details unfold, one thing becomes abundantly clear. This isn't just a case of mental illness or celebrity downfall. This is a story of secrets, of warnings ignored, of a father who feared his own son, and of a son who believes he was made to do something unthinkable. And if you think you know the Reiner family, you don't. Not yet. Let's unravel this tragedy together. Act 1. The shock heard round the world. The news broke like a nuclear bomb. Rob Reiner and wife murdered, son in custody. At first, people assumed it was a hoax. Social media is full of clickbait. Celebrity death hoaxes happen weekly. But this was different. Because within hours, the Los Angeles County District Attorney confirmed it. Nick Reiner, 32, was under arrest, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. No bail, no plea, just a shattering silence. Then came the photos. Nick in shackles. Nick in a thick green suicide smock. Nick with that 1,000-yard stare. You know that stare. It's the kind you see in documentaries. The kind that makes you feel cold even if the room is warm. And then his voice. In court, he didn't just sit silently. He didn't just plead not guilty. He screamed. He fought the bailiffs. He swore at the judge. He thrashed, muttered, howled. The courtroom, packed with press, froze. And what Nick screamed? Well, we'll get to that. Because the real story starts long before the courtroom. Act 2, A Son in Shadows. Nick Reiner wasn't just any Hollywood kid. He was a troubled prodigy, a tortured heir, a boy with more privilege than 99% of Americans, and more pain than anyone could measure. He wrote his first screenplay before he could legally drink. He also overdosed before he turned 20. Rob Reiner once admitted, in an interview, that raising Nick nearly destroyed him. We did everything, Rob said. Rehab, therapy, interventions. Nothing worked until Nick decided to fight for himself. It sounded like a happy ending. Nick got clean. Nick co-wrote a movie. Nick started speaking publicly about recovery. But was that all just smoke and mirrors? Because behind the scenes, cracks were forming again. Whispers of relapse. Explosive fights with his parents. Obsessions. Paranoia. Threats. Still, Rob stood by him. So did Michelle, who had quietly pulled back from the public eye to focus on family, on Nick, on shielding him from himself. And now they're both dead. Act 3. The crime nobody saw coming. Or did they? Here's where things get strange. According to sources close to the investigation, Rob had been worried. Deeply. For months. He reportedly told friends he felt like he was walking on a time bomb. That Nick's behavior had shifted. He wasn't just depressed. He was dark. He was hearing voices. He thought people were following him. He'd ask bizarre questions, like, do you think the world is real? Or can someone's mind be hacked? And there were reports, never confirmed by police, that Rob had even contacted a private security firm, just in case. Then, just days before the murder, Rob canceled a speaking engagement. Said he wasn't feeling well. Was it a lie? Was he scared? Was he preparing? The night of the murders, neighbors reported shouting. A crash. Then silence. When police arrived, it was a horror scene. Blood. Knife wounds. Defensive injuries. A struggle had happened. But Nick wasn't there. He turned up 4 hours later. Wandering barefoot. Covered in blood. mumbling something about a message and the mirror being broken. He was arrested without a fight. But inside the police car, dashcam footage caught one chilling phrase. "I had to do it. You don't understand. They were going to erase me." Erase him? Erase how? Act 4, the courtroom circus. Then came the arraignment. And America watched it all live. Nick entered in shackles, wearing a padded green smock, the kind used when authorities fear someone may harm themselves. His hair was wild. His eyes were hollow. And the moment the judge read the charges, he snapped. He lunged. He screamed. He thrashed at bailiffs and tried to knock over the courtroom mic. "You don't know. You weren't there," he shouted. Then, quieter, he said he'd come back. He said he'd take me with him. The room went silent. What did that mean? Who was he? Nick's defense attorney, Alan Jackson, tried to calm things. He later told reporters, "Nick Reiner is deeply unwell. He is not a monster. He is a sick young man, and this tragedy should not be exploited for entertainment." But the questions were just beginning. Act 5, America reacts. The internet exploded. Twitter, Reddit, YouTube. Everyone had a theory. MKUltra, Hollywood cult stuff. Revenge for years of pressure. Another case of ignored mental illness. Entitled Psycho Kid finally cracked. The reactions were mixed. Some offered sympathy. Some offered rage. But everyone wanted to know what actually happened inside that house. What did Rob and Michelle say to Nick before it all turned deadly? And why did Nick snap that night, and not any night before? Act 6, what comes next? Nick has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances. That means prosecutors can seek the death penalty. He's being held without bail. Psychiatric evaluations are underway. A plea of not guilty by reason of insanity is expected. But sources close to the case say prosecutors aren't convinced. They believe Nick knew exactly what he was doing, that he planned it, that he lured his parents, that he executed them in cold blood. Still, one question remains. Why? Was it a psychotic break? A cold act of revenge? A moment of uncontrollable rage? Or something worse, something orchestrated? Because according to one source who reviewed the evidence, Nick didn't just attack. He left something behind. Something written. Something that hinted at a motive far more twisted than anyone expected. But what was it? And why did police seal it from the media? Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What do you do when the villain doesn't walk into court in a suit and tie, but in chains, barefoot, and screaming that they were going to erase him? That was the question on every reporter's mind that morning. December 2nd, the Los Angeles Superior Court, Department 36. A heavy fog had rolled in just before sunrise, as if the city itself was bracing for something unspeakable. The courthouse buzzed with chaos. Journalists pushed microphones into faces, photographers elbowed each other for a shot of him. The boy who'd grown up in the shadow of movie royalty. The son of Rob Reiner. The same boy now accused of butchering both his parents in their Brentwood home, and possibly smiling afterward. The air was electric. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare the world for what was about to unfold. The doors slam open. It began with the clinking. That unmistakable jingle of shackles scraping tile. Then came the guards, 2 of them, flanking a figure barely recognizable. Nick Reiner. His hair was matted. His eyes darted like a hunted animal. And wrapped around his thin frame was a suicide smock. Thick, green, shapeless. No sleeves. No drawstrings. Nothing a person could use to hurt themselves. But it wasn't the outfit that made the room fall silent. It was the look. Vacant, yet burning. Like he wasn't fully there, but something inside him was. He shuffled forward slowly, the chains around his ankles making each step clumsy, loud. His wrists, cuffed to a belly chain, twitched constantly. Then, as if some switch was flipped, he stopped, looked around the courtroom, and spoke. Not a whisper. A declaration. "He's in here." Silence, and then screams. Everyone froze. The judge had barely raised his gavel. The bailiff hadn't even finished calling the docket. And Nick Reiner was already speaking in riddles. "He's in here," he said again. "I see him. He said I'd be safe." A journalist in the back audibly gasped. One of the guards muttered, "Jesus Christ." The judge, an experienced criminal court veteran named Angela Moreland, leaned forward. "Mr. Reiner, you will remain silent unless addressed. This is a court of law, not a circus." But Nick wasn't listening. He laughed. It was soft at first, almost childlike. Then it grew, deepened, twisted, and then he screamed, "You don't get it. I saved them. I saved them from him." The bailiffs move in. The courtroom erupted. Spectators shifted in their seats. One woman in the front row, later identified as a longtime friend of Michelle Reiner, started sobbing uncontrollably. The bailiffs, trained for moments like this, grabbed Nick by both arms and tried to pull him back. But he resisted, wrenching forward, struggling against the cuffs. "Let me speak. He's in the walls. He made me. He made me." The judge called for order. Reporters yelled questions. And Nick's attorney, Alan Jackson, stood, eyes wide with panic. "Your Honor," he said, "we request an immediate mental competency hearing. My client is clearly not. He's not what you think," Nick bellowed. And then, clear as day, he locked eyes with someone in the gallery. A man, middle-aged, unassuming. Nobody knew who he was. Not a lawyer, not family. And Nick screamed again, this time almost whispering. "You said you wouldn't come. Why are you here? Who was the man?" Let's pause for a second. Because this moment, this 1 second of eye contact, would become the most hotly debated frame in all the video footage from that day. Who was the man Nick saw? Security tried to identify him. Facial recognition came up blank. The court had no record of him. No badge, no credentials. And when officers went to question him, he was gone. Vanished into the crowd. Just a glitch in the system? Or someone meant to be there? And why did Nick lose control the moment he saw him? Coincidence? Or trigger? We'll come back to that. Because that moment opened a Pandora's box that hasn't closed since. But back in the courtroom, things were spiraling. The judge's dilemma. Judge Moreland called a recess. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. Nick wasn't just unstable. He was volatile, dangerous, loud, and clearly spiraling. Guards pulled him from the room as he thrashed and ranted. "You can't bury this," he shouted. "He's still watching. They'll all burn if you don't listen." And just like that, he was gone, dragged into a back holding cell. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Then came the whispers. What did he mean? Is he possessed? Who was that guy? Is this a setup? Even seasoned court reporters, people who've seen murderers cry, scream, threaten, said they'd never seen anything like Nick Reiner's arraignment. And this was just the beginning. The suicide smock. Let's talk about that green vest. It's not a fashion choice. It's a warning. In jail, when an inmate is placed in a suicide smock, it means authorities have determined they pose a serious risk to themselves. It's made of thick, tear-resistant material. No buttons. No sleeves. Impossible to use for strangulation. In other words, Nick Reiner had either tried to hurt himself or said something chilling enough to make guards fear he might. Some speculate he tried to gouge his own eyes out the night of the murder. Others claim he was found writing strange symbols on the walls of his cell in blood and saliva. The official report? Classified. But what we do know is this. Nick wasn't placed on suicide watch casually. He was deemed dangerous to others and himself. And that raises a terrifying question. Was this a psychotic break? Or something else entirely? Alan Jackson's damage control. Outside the courthouse, chaos reigned. Camera crews jostled for position. Helicopters hovered overhead. Talk shows were already running breaking news tickers. And then, Alan Jackson, the man now tasked with defending the undefendable, stepped up to the microphones. His face was drawn. His suit was rumpled. His eyes, red. He took a breath. Nick Reiner is a deeply ill young man, he said. This is a tragedy beyond words. But I urge the public, don't rush to judgment. Please, don't. A reporter shouted. Did he kill his parents? Jackson paused, then said, that will be determined in court. Not on Twitter. But as he turned to leave, a boom mic picked up something else he whispered to his assistant. He said something last night. I can't stop thinking about it. When pressed later about what Nick said, Jackson refused to elaborate. Why? Was it too disturbing? Too personal? Or too revealing? The public goes wild. In the hours following the court appearance, hashtags trended across every platform. Hashtag Nick Reiner breakdown. Hashtag Hollywood horror air. Hashtag Reiner trial begins. Hashtag Green Smock madness. Speculation ran wild. Some believed Nick was mentally ill and in need of compassion. Others said he was faking it to avoid the death penalty. Conspiracy theorists emerged, claiming the Reiners were involved in dark Hollywood secrets, and Nick was silenced for trying to expose it. One TikTok video, with over 12 million views, slowed down the footage of Nick staring at the mystery man in the gallery, zoomed in, and claimed you could see the man mouth something to Nick. Do it. Of course, there's no hard proof. But the seed was planted, and it grew. Back inside the holding cell. Later that afternoon, a leaked source from the LA County Sheriff's Department claimed that Nick, once returned to the holding cell, refused food, refused water, sat in the corner, mumbling the same phrase again and again. He made me do it. He made me do it. He made me do it. But who is he, and why is Nick so sure he's being watched? A chilling revelation in the evidence room. This is where things take a turn. Because while the world was focused on the spectacle in court, investigators were digging through evidence from the Reiner crime scene. And what they found shocked even the most hardened detectives. In Rob Reiner's study, beneath a loose floorboard, was a notebook. Not Rob's, not Michelle's, Nick's, filled with ramblings, diagrams, symbols, rants about control, voices, betrayal, justice. And one page, circled in red ink, contained just 3 words. Erase the architects. What did that mean? Was it delusion? Or a manifesto? Detectives aren't saying. Prosecutors won't confirm. But one source says that page might be the cornerstone of the case moving forward. And the most terrifying part? The ink was still wet. Because just when it felt like this case couldn't get more disturbing, the voices inside Nick Reiner's mind weren't done speaking. And what they demanded next would make the courtroom chaos look like a whisper. How does a child born into wealth, fame, and opportunity become the man in a suicide smock, shackled and screaming about voices in the walls? This isn't just about a courtroom breakdown. This is about the long, slow unraveling of a life that began at the very peak of privilege and descended into something darker, sadder, and ultimately deadly. Because before he was that Nick Reiner, the alleged killer, the court-screaming outcast, he was Hollywood royalty. A star is born into a world of shadows. Nick Reiner was born in 1991 to one of the most influential families in entertainment. His father? Rob Reiner, the man behind legendary films like Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, and A Few Good Men. A man hailed for his wit, morality, and cinematic genius. His mother? Michelle Singer Reiner, a philanthropist, activist, and former photographer who dedicated her life to progressive causes and raising her family away from the harshest lights of Hollywood. From the outside, it was the dream. Nick grew up in a sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills, attended elite schools, mingled with celebrity children, and had a future paved in gold. But behind those mansion gates, something was already cracking. Early signs of trouble. Teachers described young Nick as exceptionally bright, but emotionally volatile. He was quick-witted, but he was also angry. At 11, he was suspended for punching a classmate over a math problem. At 13, he was caught with marijuana at school. Rob Reiner, in later interviews, would allude to those years. We tried everything. Tutors, therapists, structure, freedom. Nothing stuck, he once said. Nick reportedly resented the constant comparisons to his father. He told friends, "Everyone thinks I'm going to be him, but I'm not. I don't want to be." And that's where things get interesting. Because unlike many Hollywood kids who drift into obscurity, Nick did have talent. The young writer with a chaotic soul. At just 16, Nick began writing scripts. Dark, sarcastic, brilliant in some places, unhinged in others. By 19, he had co-written the screenplay for Being Charlie, a semi-autobiographical film about a privileged young man battling drug addiction and a strained relationship with his father. Sound familiar? The script was raw. Too raw for many studios. But Rob believed in it. He helped get it produced. The irony? Rob directed the film himself. The story of a broken son trying to escape the shadow of a famous father, directed by the very man that story mirrored. It was an artistic gamble, and it bombed. Critics panned it as indulgent, disjointed, and emotionally manipulative. Nick was crushed. According to a friend from the production, he thought this would be his redemption arc. He thought this was his way back. But when it failed, something in him broke. The addiction spiral. By 21, Nick's addiction had escalated to full-blown crisis. Cocaine, heroin, pills, alcohol. He was in and out of rehab, sometimes staying 30 days, sometimes vanishing after 3. The Reiners, despite their resources, couldn't save him. Rob once admitted in a 2018 podcast interview, "There were nights we didn't know if we'd find him alive the next morning. Nights where we'd get phone calls from the ER, or the cops, or worse." At one point, Nick was reportedly homeless for over 6 months, living in a car near Venice Beach. And yet, even in the depths of addiction, he was writing journals, poems, scripts, rants. One former rehab roommate said Nick would scribble in notebooks for hours, muttering to himself, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, and many of those writings were dark. The warning signs everyone missed. Multiple people close to Nick say they saw it coming. One ex-girlfriend claimed he would have violent mood swings. He'd be loving and poetic one minute, then screaming about everyone trying to program me the next, she told a tabloid anonymously. Another former friend said Nick believed he was being followed. He thought there were cameras in his cereal boxes. No joke. He thought his dad was part of some Hollywood brainwashing ring. Whether these claims were exaggerated or not, one thing's clear: Nick was slipping fast. And yet, the family stayed quiet. They kept it private, controlled the narrative, hoped love and time would heal. But the damage was spreading. The strained father-son dynamic. Here's where things get especially tragic. Rob and Nick had a bond, but a painful one. It was Rob who first put Nick into rehab. Rob who flew across the country to check him into programs. Rob who tried tough love, then tried no boundaries, then circled back to tough love again. He was desperate, but conflicted. Because for all his intelligence, Rob couldn't fix his son. In a now-haunting quote from a 2020 interview, Rob said, "There's no playbook for parenting an addict, especially not when the addict is also brilliant and manipulative and hurting all the time. You just pray they find peace." But peace never came. And as Nick grew older, his anger toward his father became more vocal. He felt used, controlled, trapped. He accused Rob of turning his life into content. He accused Michelle of coddling weakness. And he once allegedly told a therapist, "They built me for their story. I was never mine." Chilling, in hindsight. The calm before the storm. In early 2023, things seemed quiet. Too quiet. Nick wasn't in the headlines. He'd reportedly started taking new medication. Was even considering writing again. Rob and Michelle were seen dining with him in public for the first time in years. There were rumors of a family reconciliation. But some insiders say it was all a facade, that the smiles were forced, that Rob had been urging Nick to enter a psychiatric care program, that Michelle had been scared, not of relapse, but of violence. In late October, Michelle confided in a close friend that something was off about Nick. "He watches me when I sleep," she reportedly said, "like he's waiting for something." Her friend urged her to leave the house, stay with someone. But Michelle, ever the protector, refused. "It's my son," she said. "I can't abandon him." 3 weeks later, she was dead. The final red flag, a letter never sent. After the murder, investigators found something chilling. A handwritten letter, crumpled in the back of Nick's desk drawer. Addressed to no one, but clearly written to someone. The contents haven't been released in full, but one leaked excerpt reads, "I didn't want this, but they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't stop. I tried to pull the curtain down. They said I was crazy. I saw the wires. I saw the truth. It's not murder if they're already gone inside." What did that mean? A metaphor? A psychotic rant? Or a confession? And more importantly, what did Nick think he was saving them from? Because in his mind, he believed this was an act of mercy. The public rewrites his story. Now, the world sees Nick as a monster. But let's rewind. This was a boy born into every privilege, who still couldn't outrun his demons. A son who wanted to love his family, but couldn't trust them. A writer who screamed for help in his pages, but was met with silence. Was he a victim of mental illness? A product of emotional neglect? A ticking time bomb ignored too long? Or was he something else entirely? Something cold, calculating, predatory. Even the prosecutors aren't sure. But the people closest to the Reiners believe something deeper was festering in Nick's mind. Something not even the best therapists and most devoted parents could reach. Because the story of Nick Reiner isn't just a Hollywood cautionary tale. It's a slow-motion horror film. And the next scene was written in blood. What happened on the night of the murders is even more disturbing than anyone expected, and it starts with a voicemail. What do you say in your final moments when the person you love most is also the one killing you? No one plans for death like this. No one expects the final person they'll ever see to be their own child. And yet, on a quiet Saturday night in November, inside a home filled with Oscar trophies, framed family portraits, and decades of Hollywood memories, Rob and Michelle Reiner died violent, gruesome deaths. Their alleged killer? Their son, Nicholas Reiner. But what actually happened that night? What was said? What was heard? What was recorded? This is the timeline of their final hours. Based on police reports, insider leaks, security footage, and one haunting voicemail that might explain everything or nothing at all. A normal day, or so it seemed. November 23rd, Brentwood, California. Thanksgiving week. Mild temperatures. Palm trees rustling in a light breeze. The kind of idyllic day where nothing should go wrong. At 9 a.m., Michelle Reiner was seen walking their golden retriever, Chewy. At 10:15 a.m., Rob called his longtime producing partner to discuss a film project they were developing. The call was short. Rob sounded tired, but otherwise fine. Around 11:30 a.m., a DoorDash order was delivered, acai bowls, 2 matcha lattes. That's the last confirmed image of Michelle Reiner alive. A Ring doorbell camera shows her smiling, tipping the driver generously, and calling out, "Nick, your match is here." He doesn't respond. The strange gap in the afternoon. Between noon and 6 p.m., nothing public happened. No outgoing texts. No phone calls. No internet activity on their home Wi-Fi, aside from the thermostat adjusting the temperature. Detectives believe this was the pressure cooker period, the hours when something snapped. Here's what we do know. At 2:07 p.m., Rob's cell pinged near the back garden. At 2:21 p.m., Michelle's phone was disabled, manually. At 4:14 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing something slam hard, like a bookshelf falling over. At 4:17 p.m., a passing jogger saw the Reiners' front door ajar, but assumed it was just a casual oversight. No screams, no alarms, no signs of panic. And yet, somewhere in that void, between the ordinary and the unspeakable, Rob and Michelle were murdered. The call that changed everything. At 5:03 p.m., Rob Reiner's sister, Annie, received a missed call from Michelle's phone. When she called back, no answer. At 5:11 p.m., she received a voicemail from Michelle, only 16 seconds long. We've heard the leaked audio, and it's horrifying. The message begins with heavy breathing. Then Michelle whispers, He's not okay. Rob, he's." A loud thud. A scream in the background. Male, muffled. "No, Nick, please, just talk to." Silence. Then static. Then the line cuts. That voicemail is the last communication the Reiners made with the outside world. And it may hold the key to the motive, the psychology, and the horror of what unfolded inside that house. The crime scene. Let's talk about what investigators found. The Reiners' home was described as disturbed, but not ransacked. This wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. It was personal. Michelle was found in the downstairs study. Rob was upstairs, in the bedroom. Both had been stabbed multiple times. The medical examiner confirmed. Rob had defensive wounds. He fought back. Michelle had a single stab wound to the heart. The weapon was a kitchen knife, missing from their own set. There were no signs of forced entry. But here's where it gets strange. Near Michelle's body, on a shattered glass table, was a photograph. Nick as a child, sitting on Rob's lap, both smiling. The glass was cracked across Nick's face. Coincidence? Or message? The walls tell a story. On the staircase leading to the second floor, investigators found writing. In smeared blood. Not in English. Not in Spanish. In symbols. Symbols resembling occult runes or sigils. Crude, misshapen, drawn in haste. An LAPD source said, off the record. It's not just gore. It's a language. He was saying something. Or warning someone. But who was the message for? Some believe it was gibberish from a man in psychosis. Others think it was deliberate, part of a deeper, darker belief system Nick had fallen into. A coded script from his journal, one yet to be decrypted. Rob's final stand. Rob Reiner didn't go quietly. According to the autopsy, he had bruising on his knuckles, scrapes on his arms, and cuts on his hands. There was blood under his fingernails. DNA that did not match his wife's or his son's. Yes, you read that right. There was a fourth DNA sample, unidentified. This revelation has sparked a tidal wave of speculation. Was someone else in the house? Was Nick acting alone? Or was someone helping him? The police won't say. The DA's office won't comment. But the case just got a whole lot more complicated. And then came the discovery in Rob's hand. A final message in ink. Clutched in Rob's right hand was a scrap of paper. Crumpled, bloody, torn from a larger sheet. It contained just 5 words. He said this would happen. No signature. No date. Just that. Who was he? Was it Nick? Was it the mysterious man from the courtroom? Was Rob trying to warn someone, anyone, that this had been predicted? We may never know. But it's hard not to read those words and feel a chill. Because this wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This felt inevitable. The dog didn't bark. One odd detail that puzzled investigators, the Reiner's dog, Chewy, their golden retriever, was home during the murders. He was found unharmed, curled up in a hallway closet. Dogs bark at strangers. They react to intruders. But according to the coroner's timeline, Chewy never alerted. So what does that tell us? Simple. Chewy knew the killer. And if Chewy didn't bark, it means the violence came from someone familiar, someone trusted, someone who had been in that house 1,000 times. Nick. Where was Nick? So where was Nick Reiner during this window of horror? That's the question everyone wants answered. Here's what we know. His phone was turned off at 1:03 p.m. At 6:17 p.m., LAPD pinged it in a neighborhood 2 miles away. At 7:45 p.m., a witness reported seeing a barefoot man covered in something dark walking along Sunset Boulevard. That man was Nick. He was detained at 8:02 p.m., mumbling nonsense, twitching, and laughing. His clothes were soaked in blood. He had a note stuffed in his back pocket. One line, scribbled hastily. You didn't listen. I had to open the gate. What gate? Metaphorical? Spiritual? Or something else entirely? The aftermath. When officers entered the Reiner home, it was quiet. Too quiet. No sirens. No alarms. No shattering glass. Just silence. Blood. A family destroyed. The responding officer reportedly vomited outside the house. A seasoned 19-year veteran of the force told the media, I've seen gangland hits. I've seen cartel murders. But this was personal. The Reiners, beloved figures in Hollywood, were gone. And the boy they tried to save, time and time again, was now their alleged killer. But the deeper they dug into Nick's behavior in the weeks prior, the more disturbing the puzzle became. Because there were signs, clues, warnings, and one voicemail, one brief, crackling moment of terror, might be the last plea for help the Reiners ever made. Because just when investigators thought they understood the timeline, they uncovered a third person who may have been there that day, someone who vanished without a trace. And what came next would unravel everything they thought they knew. What if the house itself was trying to tell investigators what happened, and no one wanted to listen? Because once the police tape went up and the doors to the Reiner home were sealed, something became very clear to the detectives who walked those halls that night. This wasn't chaos. This was intention. And intention leaves patterns. The first step inside. The moment detectives crossed the threshold, the temperature changed. Not physically, but emotionally. Seasoned homicide investigators later described it as walking into a room that had already screamed itself empty. The air was stale, heavy, like violence had soaked into the walls. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows, no alarm triggered, which meant one thing. Whoever did this belonged there. The living room, a false calm. The living room was almost pristine. Couch cushions untouched. Family photos neatly arranged. Remote controls lined up with military precision. It looked staged, too neat, and that immediately raised alarms. Because in crimes of passion, especially domestic ones, the living room is often where chaos begins. Overturned furniture, broken lamps, signs of rage. But here, nothing. It was as if the violence had been guided away from public spaces, pushed deeper into the house. Hidden. Why? Because someone didn't want the first impression to be horror. They wanted control. The kitchen. Where it started. The kitchen told a different story. One knife missing from the block. A second knife found in the sink, cleaned. Almost obsessively. Investigators found faint traces of blood in the drain, diluted but unmistakable. Someone had tried to wash something away. Something important. On the counter sat 3 mugs. 2 with dried matcha residue. 1 empty. Nick's, meaning he had been there. Calm enough to drink tea. Calm enough to sit. To talk. This wasn't an ambush. It was a conversation. And somewhere in that conversation, it turned. The study, Michelle's final moments. The study was the first confirmed site of violence. Nick Reiner's body was found near the desk, slumped unnaturally, one arm outstretched, fingertips grazing the edge of a fallen chair. There was no sign of prolonged struggle. One stab wound. Precise. Fatal. The medical examiner later said something that sent chills through the task force. She didn't see it coming. Which begs the question, what was Nick doing in that moment? Was he calm? Detached? Or was he already gone? Lost to something inside his head? On the desk sat Michelle's laptop. Still open. The screen displayed a half-written email. Unsaved. Unsent. Subject line, "We need help." The body of the email contained only 2 words. It's escalating. Escalating how? And escalating from what? The photograph. This detail almost didn't make it into the report, but it mattered. On the shattered glass table near Michelle's body lay a photograph. Nick, as a child, smiling. Rob behind him, arms wrapped around his son. Proud. Happy. The glass had fractured in a spiderweb pattern, right through Nick's face. Investigators debated whether it was symbolic or accidental. But one detective said quietly, "People don't break pictures by accident during controlled violence. They break what they're angry at." So what was Nick angry at? His parents? Or the version of himself they represented? The staircase, the writing. Then there were the symbols. Halfway up the staircase, smeared across the wall in blood, were markings that made even hardened officers pause. They weren't random. They repeated. Triangles, lines, circles intersecting at odd angles. Some officers thought they resembled occult sigils. Others said they looked like crude diagrams, maps of something unseen. Forensics confirmed the blood belonged to Nick. He had used his own hand as the brush. Why? To communicate? To warn? Or to anchor himself to reality? And here's the disturbing part. Those same symbols later appeared in Nick's notebooks, dated months before the murders. Meaning this wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed. Upstairs, Rob's last stand. Rob Reiner was found in the master bedroom. The door had been forced open from the inside, as if Rob had barricaded himself and someone broke through. The bed was overturned. A lamp smashed against the wall. Blood spattered across the headboard. This was a fight. Rob fought back. Hard. There were deep scratches on Nick's arms when he was arrested, consistent with defensive clawing. And under Rob's fingernails? DNA. Not Michelle's. Not Nick's. An unknown sample. That discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation, because it suggested one of 3 possibilities. A third person was there. Evidence contamination occurred. Nick had injured himself in a way that transferred degraded DNA. But then came the lab confirmation. The DNA was not Nick's. So who else was in that room? The knife. The murder weapon was eventually recovered. Hidden. Wrapped in a towel. Placed carefully inside a trash bin in the garage. This wasn't panic disposal. This was deliberation. And the knife itself? It was wiped clean. Too clean. Almost surgically. Which contradicted the prosecution's early narrative of an uncontrollable psychotic rage. Rage doesn't clean knives. Rage doesn't hide evidence. Unless it comes in waves. The floorboard discovery. Under a loose floorboard in Rob's study, investigators found something that made the room go silent. A notebook. Nick's handwriting. Pages filled with looping, jagged script. Some entries were poetic. Others were paranoid. Many were violent. But one page stood out. Circled. Underlined. Stained. Erased the architects. Investigators initially assumed it was metaphorical. But then they found earlier entries. Mentions of builders, designers, and handlers. Nick believed, truly believed, that his life had been constructed by others. That his thoughts weren't his own. That his parents were part of it. Architects of his suffering. And in that distorted logic, erasing them meant freedom. The dog in the closet. Chewy, the golden retriever, was found unharmed. Curled up in a hallway closet. No blood on his fur. No signs of distress. Which baffled investigators. Dogs bark. Dogs panic. Dogs protect. Unless they trust the person causing the chaos. Chewy didn't run. He hid, which suggests he was frightened, but not threatened. That detail alone convinced several detectives that Nick had been the only attacker. But then, the DNA contradicted that certainty. A house of contradictions. The Reiner home told two stories at once. One of emotional explosion. Another of chilling control. Blood and symbols, alongside clean surfaces and hidden weapons. A man in psychosis, who still remembered to wipe a blade. A son screaming about voices, who staged silence. So which was it? Breakdown or performance? Madness or mission? The unanswered question. As investigators wrapped up their first sweep, one officer reportedly said, "This house doesn't feel done." And he was right, because what they hadn't seen yet. What was still buried in digital records, security logs, and deleted files would suggest that the crime scene didn't start inside that house. It started days earlier, with a decision. A decision Nick may not have made alone. And the next discovery, found not in blood, but in data, would force prosecutors to rethink everything. Because someone had been watching the Reiner home, and someone had been logging it. What if the most terrifying part of the arrest wasn't what Nick said, but how calm he became once the cuffs went on? Because when police finally found him, hours after the bloodshed, the rage was gone. Vanished. Replaced by something far more unsettling. The call that changed the night. At 7:38 p.m., LAPD received a call from a gas station clerk near Sunset Boulevard. His voice shook. "There's a guy outside. No shoes. Covered in, I don't know, paint? Or blood. He's laughing." Then he just stops and stares at the road. The dispatcher asked the standard questions. "Is he armed? Is he threatening anyone? Is he injured?" The clerk paused. "He keeps saying, 'It's quiet now.'" Over and over. That's when officers were dispatched. Found wandering. Nick was less than 2 miles from the family home. Barefoot, hands shaking, clothes stiff and darkened. Blood had dried along his sleeves, cracking when he moved. But he wasn't panicked. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He was waiting. One officer later described it like this. "It felt like he wanted us to find him. Like the story was already finished in his head." When they approached, guns drawn, Nick raised his hands immediately. No resistance. No confusion. Just one sentence. "You're late." The body cam footage. The body cam footage would later leak in fragments. Blurry, unstable, horrifying. Officer Ramirez asked him his name. Nick smiled. "You already know." Asked if he was hurt. "No," Nick said softly. "They are." Then came the question every officer dreads asking, and every defense attorney later obsesses over. "Do you know why we're here?" Nick nodded. "Because it's done. No chase. No fight. This wasn't the arrest anyone expected. No chase through the streets. No dramatic takedown. No screams." Nick allowed the cuffs to be placed on him without flinching. As they tightened around his wrists, he exhaled, almost relieved. "You can stop watching now," he said. The officer paused. "Watching who?" Nick didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head toward the sky and whispered, "He's gone." The search. A quick pat-down revealed no weapon. No knife. No gun. But in his back pocket, officers found a folded scrap of paper. Handwritten. 4 lines. Jagged. Uneven. It read, "I tried to tell them. They closed the door. So I opened it. Now it's quiet. No names. No dates. Just a message. A confession? Or poetry?" The ride to the station. Inside the squad car, Nick sat unnaturally still. No rocking. No crying. No swearing. Just silence. Then, without being prompted, he spoke. "They were already gone," he said. The officer driving didn't respond. Nick continued. "You know how sometimes someone is standing in front of you, but they're not really there anymore?" The officer glanced in the rearview mirror. Nick was smiling again. That's what happened to them. The first shift in the narrative. At the station, things changed fast. Nick was separated, photographed, fingerprinted. And then he was placed in a holding cell. That's when the cracks began to show. He refused water, refused food, refused to sit. He paced, counted steps, tapped the wall 3 times every lap. When a guard asked what he was doing, Nick replied, "Making sure it stays closed." "What stays closed?" Nick looked confused. "Don't you hear it? The psychiatric flag." Within an hour, a jail psychiatrist was called. Not because Nick was violent, but because he wasn't reacting like a man who'd just been arrested for the alleged killing of his parents. No shock, no grief, no fear, just detachment. The psychiatrist noted several red flags. Flat effect, dissociation, delusional language, possible auditory hallucinations. And one more thing. Nick repeatedly asked if the lights could be turned off. Not because they hurt his eyes, but because, he said, he can see better when it's bright. The moment that terrified the guards. At 11:42 p.m., a guard heard Nick laughing. Softly, then louder, then abruptly stopping. When the guard approached the cell, Nick was standing perfectly still, facing the wall. The guard asked what was funny. Nick replied, "He thinks I did it alone." That's when the guard called for backup. Because Nick wasn't laughing anymore. He was crying. And through tears, he whispered something that never made it into the official report, but circulated among staff like a ghost story. "They promised they'd take me too." The evidence arrives. While Nick sat in custody, detectives began piecing together the physical evidence. The blood, the knife, the symbols. And the more they reviewed it, the less the case looked simple. Yes, the scene pointed inward. Yes, Nick was the only known person present. But nothing about the crime felt impulsive. And nothing about the arrest felt final. Because someone who commits an act of uncontrollable rage doesn't calmly wait to be found. They don't tidy pieces of the story. They don't speak like the ending has already been written. The first interview. When detectives finally attempted a formal interview, Nick refused a lawyer. Then changed his mind. Then changed it again. Finally, he agreed to answer one question. Just one. Why did you go back inside after it was over? Nick stared at the table for a long time. Then said, to make sure the door was really closed. What door? Nick leaned forward. And for the first time since his arrest, his voice dropped to a whisper. The one they opened for him. A case that refused to sit still. By sunrise, the story had already escaped the building. Media vans lined the street. Speculation exploded. Narratives hardened. But inside the station, detectives weren't celebrating a clean arrest. They were uneasy. Because Nick Reiner didn't act like a man who'd been caught. He acted like a man who believed the worst part was already over. And that belief, whatever fueled it, was about to drag the investigation somewhere no one expected. Because the next piece of evidence didn't come from blood or walls or notebooks. It came from a digital trail. A trail that suggested Nick wasn't as alone as everyone thought. And once that trail was uncovered, the case stopped being about what happened and started being about who had been watching long before the arrest ever happened. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most dangerous moment in this case wasn't the night of the killings, but the first private conversation after the arrest? Because that's when Nick Reiner stopped talking about voices in the walls and started saying things that made even his own lawyer step back. The first meeting. Alan Jackson arrived at the station just after dawn. He'd defended people the public had already condemned. He'd seen performances, breakdowns, theatrics meant for cameras and juries. He knew the difference between panic and calculation, or at least he thought he did. Nick was brought into the interview room wearing a wrinkled jail uniform, wrists cuffed in front of him, posture oddly relaxed. No eye contact at first. Alan introduced himself. Calm. Professional. "I'm here to help you," he said. "But I need you to tell me the truth." Nick looked up and smiled. "You already know it," he said. "They told you." Alan frowned. "Who told me?" Nick tilted his head, considering. "The ones who write the endings." A conversation that didn't behave. Alan began with basics. Did Nick understand why he was there? Did he understand the charges? Did he understand the seriousness? Nick nodded to each. Yes. 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 Clear. Or clear enough. Then Alan asked the question every defense attorney asks first. Did you hurt your parents? Nick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked something back. Have you ever watched a house burn? He said, and realized the fire didn't start where everyone thinks it did. Alan paused. This isn't a metaphor, Nick added. It's a map. The warning. Alan tried redirecting. We need to focus, he said. Everything you say matters. Nick leaned forward, voice steady now. That's why you shouldn't be here. Alan blinked. What do you mean? Nick lowered his eyes. They don't like witnesses. A chill ran through the room. Alan had sat across from murderers who bragged, who lied, who broke down crying. None of them spoke like this. Calm, intentional, almost apologetic. Nick looked up again. You should tell them not to rush, he said. If they rush, they'll miss him. Miss who? Alan asked. Nick hesitated. then shook his head. "Never mind," he said softly. "They always do." The phrase that wouldn't let go. The meeting ended shortly after. Alan walked out pale, distracted. When a reporter shouted questions outside the station, he offered a single statement. "My client is deeply unwell. Please don't rush to judgment." It sounded rehearsed. But what no one heard, what only Alan admitted later to a colleague, was the phrase Nick whispered just before guards pulled him away. A sentence that wouldn't leave Alan's mind. He said this would happen. The same words later found in Rob Reiner's hand. The same words scribbled on the paper at the scene. The same words Nick muttered in his sleep that night, according to guards. And Alan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't coincidence. The shift in strategy. By mid-morning, the defense team convened. Psychiatrists, investigators, consultants. The initial plan, mental incompetence, seemed obvious. But Alan hesitated, because incompetence implied chaos. And nothing about Nick felt chaotic anymore. He wasn't flailing. He wasn't incoherent. He was focused. Which raised a terrifying contradiction. What if Nick was sick, but also purposeful? What if he believed his delusions so completely that he acted on them with clarity? That gray zone, the one juries struggle with, was now the center of the case. The public narrative versus the private one. Outside, headlines hardened. Mentally ill son snaps. Hollywood heir's psychotic break. Tragedy of untreated illness. But inside the legal teams, doubt crept in. Because Nick wasn't asking about his parents. Not once. He didn't ask if they were dead. Didn't ask where they were. Didn't cry. Instead, he asked one recurring question. Is it quiet yet? Quiet from what? No one knew. The psychiatric evaluation. The court ordered an emergency psychiatric evaluation that afternoon. 2 doctors. Independent. Experienced. They spent 3 hours with Nick. At the end, they agreed on several things. He was experiencing delusional thinking. He believed in an external controlling force. He showed signs of dissociation. But they disagreed on the most important point. Whether he understood right from wrong. One doctor believed Nick knew exactly what he'd done and why society would condemn it. The other believed Nick thought he was preventing something worse. Saving others. Stopping an unseen catastrophe. That split opinion would later become the fault line of the entire trial. The night in isolation. Nick was placed on suicide watch that night. Not because he asked for it. Because he laughed when a guard asked if he felt regret. "I feel relief," Nick said. Then, quietly. "And fear. Because I don't know if it worked." That sentence triggered the suicide smock. Because it suggested unfinished business. Unresolved belief. And possibly expectation. Alan's private crisis. That night, Alan couldn't sleep. He replayed the conversation in his head. The calm. The warnings. The certainty. He defended people who claimed demons told them to kill. But Nick didn't describe commands. He described agreements. Promises. Deals. And that terrified him. Because agreements imply consent. The DA's move. Across town, the district attorney's office prepared its own narrative. This was not a mystery to them. This was a domestic homicide. A privileged man with a history of addiction and instability snapped. Period. They prepared charges accordingly. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Special circumstances. No bail. And they quietly began exploring the possibility of the harshest penalty. Because in their view, Nick hadn't lost control. He'd made a choice. The question no one asked out loud. As night fell, 2 parallel stories solidified. One of madness. One of malice. But beneath both ran a question no one wanted to ask publicly. What if Nick Reiner believed he was protecting the world? And what if that belief wasn't born the night of the murders, but planted long before? Because the next evidence wouldn't come from interviews or bloodstains. It would come from a digital footprint. A record of searches, messages, and connections that suggested Nick hadn't been spiraling alone. And once that trail surfaced, even the skeptics would start asking, who had been feeding the fear? And why now? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the most dangerous weapon in this case wasn't the knife, but the screen Nick stared into every night? Because long after the blood was cleaned and the house sealed, investigators discovered something far more unsettling than symbols on walls or words whispered in court. They found a trail, a digital one, and it suggested that Nick Reiner's descent didn't happen in isolation. The first download. It started with a routine warrant. Nick's phone, his laptop, an old tablet found in the guest room. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual. Until a tech analyst noticed something strange. Nick had wiped his phone clean 2 weeks before the murders. Factory reset. No photos. No texts. No call logs. But he'd missed one thing. The cloud. And that's where the story cracked open. The search history that didn't make sense. At first glance, the searches looked like classic paranoia. How to know if thoughts are implanted. Signs reality is being edited. Are memories programmable? Investigators had seen this before in cases involving psychosis. But then the pattern shifted. Nick wasn't just asking questions. He was responding to answers. He clicked the same obscure forums again and again. The same anonymous message boards. The same private chat servers. And on those boards, someone had been talking to him. Not mocking. Not dismissing. Encouraging. The handle, architect_7. The username appeared dozens of times. Architect_7. Never aggressive. Never commanding. Always calm. Reassuring. Certain. Messages recovered from server backups revealed conversations that stretched back months. At first, they read like philosophical debates. Nick, what if the pain isn't random? Architect_7. Pain is never random. It's designed. Nick, by who? Architect_7. Those who build systems. Nick, can systems be broken? Architect_7. Only from the inside. Slowly, subtly, the tone changed. The messages grew more personal, more intimate. Architect_7 didn't tell Nick what to do. He validated what Nick already feared, reinforcing the delusion. One exchange stood out. Nick, sometimes I think my parents are part of it. Is that possible? Architect_7. It's common for architects to be close to their creations. Nick, what if I can't escape? Architect_7. Then you change the design. That message was sent 11 days before the murders. And suddenly, Nick's journal entries made sense. Erase the architects. It wasn't just a phrase. It was an idea planted, watered, and allowed to grow. Coincidence or cultivation? Investigators debated fiercely. Was Architect_7 a troll? A conspiracy theorist? Or something worse? Because when they traced the IP addresses, they didn't lead to one location. They led to many. Servers, proxies, VPNs, deliberate obfuscation. Someone who knew how to stay hidden. Someone who didn't want to be found. The forum that vanished. When authorities tried to subpoena the message board itself, they hit another wall. The forum was gone. Taken offline within hours of the arrest. No announcement. No archive. Just erased. As if someone had been watching the watchers. And that raised a chilling possibility. What if Nick wasn't the only one being monitored? The behavioral shift. Psychiatrists reviewing the digital evidence noted a clear turning point. Before Architect_7, Nick's writings were chaotic, emotional, self-blaming. After the messages began, they became structured, purpose-driven. He stopped asking why he was suffering and started asking what needed to be done. That's not how psychosis usually progresses. Delusions tend to fragment thought. This organized it. The question of influence. The prosecution dismissed the digital trail as noise, online nonsense feeding an already unstable mind. But the defense saw something else. Patterned reinforcement, gradual escalation, psychological grooming, not orders, but framing. And in court, framing can be everything. Because if someone helps shape a belief system that leads to violence, where does responsibility end? And where does manipulation begin? The third presence revisited. Remember the unidentified DNA? The man Nick saw in the courtroom gallery? Investigators began cross-checking. IP access logs, server timestamps, public records. One login to the forum, weeks before the murders, came from a cafe 2 blocks from the Reiner home. The same cafe where Nick had been seen multiple times that month. Coincidence? Or was someone closer than anyone realized? The message after the arrest. Then came the final twist. A message sent from Architect_7's account, 3 hours after Nick's arrest. Posted publicly. Brief. Chilling. The door is closed. But others remain. The post was deleted within minutes. But not before screenshots spread among investigators. If it was a troll, it was a cruel one. If it was something else, it meant Nick might not have believed he was acting alone. The defense's gamble. Alan Jackson reviewed the digital evidence late into the night. He didn't see a mastermind. He didn't see a clear accomplice. He saw something far more dangerous. An echo chamber that turned fear into mission. And Nick, isolated, desperate, searching, had found meaning there. Not absolution, but direction. The defense would later argue that this wasn't just untreated illness. It was targeted reinforcement. A slow push. Enough to tip someone already teetering. The prosecutor's counter. The DA wasn't moved. People read garbage online every day, they argued. They don't murder their parents. Nick had a choice. He made it. And no username on a screen could change that. But even within the DA's office, unease grew. Because no one could answer the simplest question. Who was Architect_7? And why did he disappear the moment the case broke open? The uncomfortable truth. As the investigation expanded, one reality became unavoidable. Nick Reiner hadn't snapped in a vacuum. He'd been spiraling, but someone, or something, had given his spiral a shape, a narrative, a justification. And whether that influence was intentional or incidental, it had left fingerprints all over the case. Not physical ones, psychological ones. The cliffhanger. By the end of the week, investigators had a new task force. Not to re-examine the murders, but to find a ghost. A digital presence that might hold the key to Nick's beliefs and possibly to others like him. Because if Architect_7 was real, if he'd done this before, then Nick Reiner wasn't the end of the story. He was the beginning. And just as the courtroom prepared for the next explosive hearing, a former nanny stepped forward with a memory she'd buried for years. A memory that suggested Nick's fear of being designed might not have started online at all, but in his own childhood home. And what she was about to reveal would make everyone question the Reiner family's past. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming.